Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Kevin Chu. I'm on the product marketing team at Okta, and you're listening to the Meet Your Okta Identity Expert podcast. It's a series of podcasts where we bring Okta's professional services experts to share some of their experiences and knowledge from their different deployments managing customer identities or customer identities across today's landscape. At Okta, I focus on our customer identity products. For today's podcast, we're going to discuss and meet Joe Witt, one of our leading professional services experts at Okta. Joe, before we dive into specific topics, it'd be great to learn a little bit about you. Can you give us a little bit about your background and how you found yourself at Okta?
Well, first, thank you for having me on your podcast. So I started my career about 20 plus years ago in the United States Air Force, where I specialized in telecommunications and security systems on the reconnaissance aircraft. So after my stint in the Air Force, I decided that I wanted to continue my career in technology. So I ended up accepting an offer at Anderson Consulting, where from that point, I specialized in application integration. As part of that experience, one of the things that I ended up having the opportunity to do was to work for a company that didn't quite know yet that they were an identity company. But in that experience, I came in and helped and eventually became part of that organization and sort of helped them build out their identity and access management platform, which turned out to be, a cloud-based identity platform, much like Okta. And during that experience, right, it took, I learned not only about identity, but application integration. So the challenges of identity, access, but also how do they access applications. And from there, for the last 15 years, I've been specializing mostly in just the identity and access management space. And obviously Okta being a leader in the identity space, when I had the opportunity, I really wanted to come over to continue my career in the identity access management space, but also to, be part of a growing company and further my experience and knowledge in the space.
Joe, it's interesting. You talk a bit about kind of some of the breadths and the journey of your experience over the course of 20 years. How do you feel like identity has evolved? In fact, you made the comment that, you didn't even know you were necessarily in identity at the time. How have you seen identity evolve over the last 20 years, but even, I think we've seen a bit of acceleration and evolution even just in the last 5 years.
Oh, for sure. So, when I look back at my 15 plus years dealing with identity and access management, when I look at when I first came into the experience, it was around how does a company integrate with other companies, right? Was really the core premise of what I started with. And that turned out to well, that's great. I have all these applications and all these disparate systems, but how does a person get access, right? And back then, right, it was, I just have 20 different accounts and I'm logging into each one. And, if I was terminated or didn't have access anymore, it was like, so what? We'll just leave them in there. And obviously, as we expand in the technology and these people become, part of multiple different organizations and, controlling that access was critical, right? And as I start seeing the evolution, it's not just a user account in the system with a username and password, right? It was concepts of, well, how do I bridge across these applications and treat an identity as a single identity and allow them to get access into different applications, which brings up those concepts of federated identity and single place to log in, but access to multiple applications. And that trend is still going, right? Now, it started years ago with SAML being, pretty core concept to start bridging the gap. And now, you're starting to see it evolve even more because the challenges it's just not applications anymore, right? There's services, there's, web APIs, and you have to think holistically across the identity and how they access all those different systems and services.
So let's talk a little bit about your Okta experience. At this point, you've been with us for a few years. How many customers have you helped to date, and what are the type of deployments that you typically come across today?
Well, that's an interesting question because I have been here for 2 years, and if I take a look at my customer folder, I have quite a few, right? At least 50 customers that I've helped in my 2 years that I've been here. The nice part is it's from small to large, large customers, right? And it's interesting to see that, some of the challenges between smaller engagements and larger engagements with, more enterprise level customers. One of the things that you see out there a lot is an employee solution, right? Okta does a great job at solving, right? So getting employees out to cloud applications or other externalized services. Some of the challenges start to come in is when you start to deal with larger enterprises, and the fact that there's not just employees, right? There's different identity types, right? It could be employees, contractors, suppliers. Even customers, right, that need access to the same applications, and that's one of the areas that I see from an evolution standpoint, and starting to see a lot more customers is how can they utilize Okta for not only for employees, but how do I do this with my other identity types?
Great. And I don't know if everybody is familiar with our professional services group. Generally speaking, when do customers bring Okta's team in? Are there specific scenarios that you most commonly see, either for workforce identity or for customer identity, that tend to bubble up?
Well, I don't think there's really a distinction between when I say distinction between workforce and customer examples. I think a lot of times customers look to Okta professional services for the expertise, right? We've done this before, and we can help you through. You don't have to start from day one and do it all yourself, right? And Okta PS brings in that expertise that allows you to get to hit the ground running, right? You're not starting off. You're starting off at a sprint, because a lot of times engagements are around. Not only maybe a specific use case, but it might be around a security concern, or something has happened in the past and auditability and things need to be there. So those projects typically can't be long, drawn out projects, right? They have to be something that I'm getting the right expertise, the right knowledge to make sure that I'm doing this right on day one, and not finding out later that I might have done something.
Actually, Joe, you said something interesting at the beginning. You don't think so much that, of course, there are some differences, but you don't necessarily differentiate between a workforce or customer example. It's more so that there are specific problems that you're trying to solve. That being said, how often is it that you have a customer that comes to you that has a really broad breadth of kind of, identity roles that they need to solve for? So by that, I mean, for instance, you have both employees, but maybe partners, maybe customers, and the diversity of the type of profiles that you need to manage present problems. How often is that part of their challenge?
Well, you typically see that in larger organizations, right, that are really looking at the applications they may have internally, as well as cloud-based applications, where they're challenged with how do I allow external identities to access my systems in a secure and controlled way, right? I mean, that's the critical piece. And and smaller companies that are just trying to do an employee-focused use case typically aren't challenged with that. Now, it doesn't mean they're not going to expand and have that challenge in the future, which is critical to success for not only larger or smaller companies, and make sure that when we're deploying and looking at best practices is to making sure that for that customer, be it the small or the large one, we're not excluding or hindering them being able to bring on different identity types, right? And so that way they have a central control, something that they can build on, in the future, right? And so for the larger customers, it's typically the case, right? They're not just dealing with employee access anymore, right? They have suppliers, they have contractors, they have different systems where they control these users, right? A lot of times employees are sourced from maybe an HR system or maybe from AD, but suppliers, probably not, right? If it's a larger organization, they probably have a supplier contract system where that data sources from those places. And then those are where the challenges start to come in, especially for that integrated enterprise identity.
Joe, you talked about customers coming to you or coming to Okta or Okta's professional services team with problems that need solving, not necessarily specific. They may not necessarily know how to solve it yet. How do you think about building out the plan or the strategy to solve the problem? Is it a specific set of questions that you tend to ask, or are there sets of kind of foundational sets of information that you need in order to inform how you think about building out their solution? Because I can imagine the spectrum of potential customized problems is broad.
Yes, and being that I spent most of my career as a person in professional services, not just in the identity space, I guess I bridge on that expertise as a way to come in, and I know I'm coming in for an identity engagement, but in certain cases there's more to it, right? There's other underlying issues or concerns or requirements that aren't just specifically focused on identity. So when I engage a customer, it's typically asking the basic questions, right? It's asking, who, when, where, what, and how, right? Those core consultant principles, right? Is to make sure that you understand the full breadth of the engagement. Sometimes it's simple, and sometimes you start to ask the questions that start to open up other areas, where either they weren't expecting, right, or it's something they just didn't think about, and so making sure that you're engaging the customer, right? That's the biggest thing to me. It's very common, with some younger consultants to come in and sort of not engage and don't ask the right questions, right? So over the course of years, really engaging and allowing your customers to answer open-ended questions allows you to discover more of the problem, and making sure that you're solutioning correctly, right? So that way you aren't just pigeonholing into one thing. That there might be a bigger picture, right? That leads to customer success, and one of the biggest things as a consultant is I want that customer to want me to come back, right? So when they want to tackle that next big identity problem, I definitely want them to be able to reach back out to me.
I'd love to hear some stories. Are you able to give probably an anonymous example of something that's indicative of a customer engagement, how we engaged, what problems they were trying to solve, and how you walked yourself or walked the team through the progression to solve that problem?
Sure. So I have, hundreds of hundreds of cases that I can go through, but I'll try to pick the one that I think covers, call it an integrated enterprise identity, right? So in this particular scenario, I'm going to walk through, an engagement where there was about 100 backend applications, including some cloud-based applications that this particular customer wanted or needed access to, right? And this included their employees. This included potential customers, which brings a challenge there, and I'll explain that a little bit. But also, I'll call them suppliers, right? And so in this particular case, they had potential suppliers that needed access but weren't really a supplier yet. And then they had employees that controlled all of the capabilities within the product. So to get users to get into the system, it was critical that they had to solve all these. So coming into that engagement, again, going through the what, who, when, where, and how is very important. So first understanding why did they need this, right? And the key thing there is they want these suppliers really are their customers, right? The harder it is for their suppliers to use their systems, basically means they might not use them, right? And move on to something else. So it was critical that these dealers could get in and quickly, right, and slow down that process of onboarding. So that was call it a very big open requirement for them. And then the other thing is they didn't want to hinder their employees, right? They wanted their employees to be able to get in and do their job efficiently and not have to wait for the suppliers, right? And so it was one of these things where it required both of those, right? And then they had suppliers that weren't suppliers yet, but they needed access to certain applications, and that was really driving a motive for sales, right? To say, hey, suppliers, come in, you guys can use these. You don't have to be a supplier yet, but we want you access, right? And then over time they would be converted to a supplier.
And I assume from there they then have to also think about the right security policies. You have such a broad, not just set of roles, but also very different use cases there.
Oh, for sure. Because one of the things that these applications required is they identify suppliers by supplier codes, right? So every user that would have access would have to have access to certain sets of supplier codes as well. So that gets into talking about the identity and the identity profile, right? Again, it's coming down to, it's not just a Joe Witt and username and password, right? So maybe some MFA. It turned out that the profile itself was more complex than just basic attributes. And I think as you start to bridge into larger enterprise, that concept is very common.
Right? It's not an uncommon situation and use case that we see. In this case, what type of support were they looking for from you and the professional services team?
Well, I think they were looking at our guidance and best practices, right? Now, in some circumstances, there isn't a best practice yet, right? They're sort of bridging into something new, which is somewhat what this customer is doing. But having the Okta professional services there, gave them some of the comfort, right? That we're thinking through their requirements and taking them along this path, making sure that one, they were utilizing Okta the right way, right? Which is critical, right? I mean, Okta is a great platform. But at the same time, since you can develop on top of the platform, you can make mistakes. So, having expertise was critical for this customer, because they wanted to make sure. Again, going back to that, how do you start running instead of just walking, right? Having that there and the confidence that, well, I know we're integrating to Okta the right way, and we're utilizing the product in a way that we're going to be able to onboard all these 100 applications, including these thousands of suppliers, with confidence.
Let's double click into that. Many times I run into customers that don't have a solution that's ready out of the box. They come to you looking for some guidance and help. What do you do in those scenarios, or how do you help them think through the best approach for scenarios like that?
Well, that's a great question, because it is a discovery phase, right? One of the tenets that I always try to drive is, hey, let's take baby steps, right? We shouldn't try to solve the whole egg, we don't solve the whole problem if we don't have to day one. But let's make sure that what we're establishing and what we're putting in is a framework to build on, right? So a lot of times when you're in with the customer and you're looking at the requirements, it's let's let's look at this in pieces to make sure that we're not, that we're building a solution that's going to, make that customer successful in the future, right? So again, it's going down, and I always go back to that open-ended questions, right? It's when you talk to a customer, it's not always prescriptive. Now there are places where you have to be prescriptive, but a lot of times it's making sure that they're engaged, and so that way you're getting the full problem. So when you start to put together that phased approach, right? Maybe we can get a customer on and utilizing the platform to secure certain aspects, right? Some critical step one, day one items, and then walk through different phases where we coexist. Right? Maybe your current identity system is suitable for one type of identity, but not the other. Let's let them coexist for a while you go through a phased migration approach, right? And that's where PS really can help out and make sure that how those migrations and phases work are going to be.
Great, Joe. Let's bring this back full circle. We started the conversation talking about your personal experiences and your personal journey or your career journey. Given your breadth of experiences, given the totality of customer use cases that you've seen, what is your favorite part about this job? What is it that makes this interesting, or what is it that kind of makes it really exciting for you on a day-to-day basis?
Oh, well, that's a good question. One is I'm passionate for identity and access management.
I mean, you've been doing it for 20 years, right? There must be something good.
So I find that, I guess when you look at identity and access management, just from a industry perspective, right? It's something that it's never going to be stagnant, right? It's something that is always going to evolve, right? I mean, look at what we've been through for the last 20 years, right? Some things weren't even secure back then, right? It was just open door, right? I mean, people didn't really know that it was there. It's just I can get access. And I think as evolution, especially in the internet and social and everything's come about, it puts a lot of complexity into the concept of identity, right? And that goes across both enterprise all the way to individual consumers, right? To the individual. And I think that sort of drives me and keeps motivating me to, be an expert in the identity and access management space. Just because I don't think I'll never be I hate to say it, but I'll never be the expert, right? I'm constantly learning. I think that, call it expert continual learning, because the identity, that's going to change, right?
Yeah.
And for me to stay as an expert, right, I have to stay on top of, how this evolution is happening, right?
And actually, on that point, I think you're further along the expertise spectrum than most. What would you tell folks that are just starting out their careers? If they're on the very left end of the spectrum and they're just starting to think about either technology, but also maybe more specifically professional services, if they want to think about a career in it. What would your guidance be to them for how they can best position themselves, but also build the right skill sets in order to be a really good practitioner in the space?
Sure. I think, if I was to mentor a younger consultant, right, it would be, consultants need to be experts in everything, right? And I guess that's more of a perception, right? So, when you walk in, one is listening to your customer, but also making yourself an expert, right? It's making sure you're perceived within the customer as an expert, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean you know everything, but it does mean that you know how to problem solve. And I think that's one of the key things for a consultant, right? You have to listen, and then you have to be able to solve the problem.
Right.
And that's very critical. And some of that takes experience, So as a younger consultant, I would say, listen to the customer, learn from your mentors, right? And always be learning. Don't ever stop, right? Don't be complacent and think that you know everything, because there's a lot to learn.
Great, thanks, Joe. That's great guidance. Especially we often hear it's hard to break into the space just because it requires so much expertise, whether it's about the technology, whether it's about how you work with customers. So that guidance is incredibly helpful. Joe, thank you again for joining us today and sharing some of your experiences and guidance for both the product as well as those thinking about a career in the space. To our audience, thank you for joining us, and be sure to stay tuned for another session of Meet Your Okta Identity Expert in the podcast series. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.